So let's get started. I have a little game for you to play as you sit. The boxes are empty. You can take the percentages and place them next to the statements that you think as I explain where this comes from, because this comes from that seminar that I did in Chicago. And this was from Stanford University. And what was happening there was we had great acronym students, great educated students that had the best ACT, SAT, GPA, AP classes. You go down the acronym list, that's who gets to go to Stanford, right? But they couldn't keep kids in their school. And this was what was being presented to me in Chicago. And we were trying to figure out why, and they had studied it. And they went around the country to see, was this a Stanford problem or an everybody problem? Turns out it was an everybody problem, and these were the statistics that they had. And what happened was they started to see that there was a problem. Although they had acronym kids, they were missing attributes. Okay, and so what this made me think of, what made me think about was that there's something that we can do as an educator, right? I have this fork in the road, all right? And then you think, well, Kevin, that's from 2012. It's 2021. Don't you have anything more recent than that? Things are probably better. And in 2017, the book iGen came out, the internet generation, the generation we're leading and raising. And what was crazy was all of those statistics were exactly the same, except that the seriously considered suicide number was almost doubled. So in 5 years, not only have we not gotten better, we had actually gotten worse. And it makes me wonder about 2022. And this is where I was at in Chicago thinking, what can I do? I can keep going, doing a good, noble thing that I know is right, which is educating, caring about kids, loving them, doing my job the way I'm doing it. Or I can try to figure out how to make a change, which path to take. And so I decided to take the harder path, one small step at a time. And what I came across was in my research was this quote from Karen Abel, who says, when children aren't given the space to struggle through things on their own, they don't learn to problem solve very well. They don't learn to be confident in their abilities, and it can affect their self-esteem. I'll allow you to read the rest while I tell you that I thought the rest, the reason it's highlighted in blue back then was because it related to those statistics that I showed you before. But really what haunted me the most, the more I worked with this quote, was the first sentence that says, when children aren't given the space to struggle. And I thought to myself, who is not giving the space? And I had to point the finger at myself, the teacher, the coach, the parent, the adult, the mentor. We are not giving them the space, and it's turning them into these percentages. And so this really piqued my interest. And as I began to research from so many different people, so many different places, I started to be able to piece wonderfully smart people doing excellent work together to come up with some conclusions that drove my work. Students are more stressed, overwhelmed, and depressed than ever before. We saw that in the percentages. Students are shielded from this suffering and this failure and this challenge by well-meaning, loving people like you and I. Right? They're shielded from that bulldozer mentality. Okay, it's very common, the snowplow mentality, right? What happens in our society and in our circles is that we want our kids to be happy. We want them to feel loved, to be happy, to be excited, and we don't want to see them sad. And so a lot of times what we can do is plow the way so they can walk through unscathed, because we don't want them to turn into those percentages. And if we can keep them happy, then they won't turn into those percentages. And unfortunately, that's not the way that it works, but we know that this happens all the time. One place it happens in athletics is the email, the phone call, or the text message that says, I'd like to meet with you about Jimmy, my son, but you can't tell Jimmy that I'm meeting with you. And right there, what we see is a snowplow mentality. It's not misfounded, it's founded in love and care for Jimmy. So there's nothing wrong with our desire to love and care for Jimmy. The problem is that we're going ahead and we're going to fix it so that he can walk through unscathed and not deal with it. And he can just have the experience that we want for him. And Paul Tough tells us, a researcher on adversity, he tells us that kids have to have that experience. They have to have the toughness. He talks about something that he did where one group of people, one thing that we can do to work with adversity is to just throw people outside, give them a shovel and say, shovel all this snow. We leave them on their own. Good luck, go for it. And what happens in those scenarios, Paul Tough says, they fail. They don't make it. They can't survive. The other way we can do it is we can snowplow. We can plow it all for them and say, hey, walk through this nice, clean area. And then we still know that they don't survive because of the percentages that we saw. He says the only way that we as leaders, as parents, is to walk alongside them, to each grab a snow shovel, to each start shoveling, coming up with strategies together, talking to each other, working together, problem solving together, being a guide together as we shovel that snow. So that shared adversity, not letting them out of it, not letting them suffer in it. The other thing, students are entitled and obsessed with immediate results. We know this from social media. We live in a microwave society. Everything is instant and now. And the problem with that is that grit is the opposite of instant. Grit is a marathon, not a sprint. And so if we have a society wired for immediacy, we have a society wired to lack grit and lack resilience. And that bothered me. And the other thing that bothered me was, as much as we were doing to make kids academically successful, they weren't making it in college, so who cares how successful they were in the books? We have to be able to do something different. And what I thought was, this has to do with grit. It has to do with our ability to be resilient. And so I turned to the world's most formal researcher on that, which is Angela Duckworth. And she defines grit as a demonstration of perseverance and passion for very long-term goals. She tells us that talent is unrelated or inversely related to someone's level of grit, which means the person who's highly talented often had a low level of grit. And a lot of times that was because it was so easy for them that they didn't have to work at it. And so when the rubber met the road, they didn't have the grit to make it through that challenge. But on the other hand, if you think about it, people who have less talent, they had more grit in her research, that inverse relationship, because the people that had less talent knew that the work was the key to making up the talent gap. And that allowed them to be grittier and tougher over time. And finally, as I said before, grit is a marathon, not a sprint. And she inspired me to take my best ideas, my strongest intuitions, to try them, to fail, and to start over, to be gritty about getting kids grittier, as she says. And so what I came up with is this idea of grit leadership, this theory of leadership. And it was built on this idea of parente, a Latin word, which literally means to bring forth. And it was the root word of parent. So when we look at it this way, we've talked about how parenting, a lot of times we try to make our kids happy and give them these great experiences so that they can have it better, have more. But really what the original said, maybe we can take a lesson from the original, was maybe it's to bring forth the potential in our child. Not bring forth the happiness, but bring forth the potential. So how do we parente? How do we bring forth grit?